Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 122. It's going to be titled The Unwanted, and it's going to be part one. Thank you to Beth for writing in and saying that she's been enjoying the recent stories, so I appreciate that. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And here we go. Dan had the vacuum cleaner over his lap on the sofa. The last screw was almost removed from the skirt when the doorbell rang. "Alice, could you get that? My hands are full," he called. "Sure," she called back. It sounded like she was upstairs, but she hustled down. She opened the door, and he pried the skirt off the vacuum with difficulty. He didn't know how the quarter had gotten jammed up there so hard. He only wished he'd seen it before he'd run it over. He didn't hear Alice say hello, but then he heard her say something he couldn't understand, which was strange because the family room wasn't that far from the front door. Then he heard the front door shut. Alice had gone outside. He'd assumed it was the Girl Scouts or maybe someone selling roof repair. He dismissed it. If it was the Girl Scouts, she was probably going to buy some cookies. And she didn't like to keep the door open because the cat would sometimes try to get out. He popped the quarter out with the tip of the screwdriver, made harder by the fact that it was a Phillips head, and spun the roller by hand. It seemed like it would work. The brushes moved, and so did the belt. He screwed the skirt back on and stood the vacuum upright. Then he plugged it back in and turned it on. It worked. He smiled and ran the vacuum around the room. Then he caught movement in the corner of his eye. Alice was standing there, looking at him, shaking. He turned off the vacuum and went over to her. "What's wrong?" She paused a moment, then said, "Randall." "He was here?" She nodded. "I told him to leave." "Did he take a vacation or something? He lives back in Nevada." "I don't know." "What did he say?" "What is making you shake?" Dan embraced her, held her close. She spoke into his shoulder. "He wants me back." "We've been together for almost 3 years. We moved to another state." "Some people," Dan said, putting on a bit of an air, "just won't take a hint." Alice gave a laugh that was a bit like a sob. "He came all this way to, what, just ask if you'd come back to him?" Dan asked gently. "Pretty much. He got upset when I told him to leave." "Shit, I didn't hear that." "I had the vacuum on." "I know." He left, screaming, but he left. "Are you in danger? What is he likely to do?" "I don't know. If he comes around again, I'll get a restraining order put on him." Dan hugged her close. During dinner, Dan suggested they get a security system. Alice agreed. They were in a good neighborhood without crime and hadn't really considered it before. That night, Alice was on her computer upstairs. She was getting involved in local politics and was looking at running for the school board. They hadn't been in the neighborhood very long, which would be a hindrance, but she'd been on the school board back in Reno. And this was a much smaller school district, and she hoped her experience with a big, complicated district would both help her get elected and be an asset when she was on the board. But Dan was restless. He wasn't a big computer guy. He'd rather watch TV, so he was watching some evening baseball, but only partly. Mostly he found himself getting up and moving around on any excuse. He peed 4 times, even though he only had to the first time. Got a beer, wandered around, checked his email on his phone, took a cup to the sink. And he found himself wanting to check the windows. He realized Randall had gotten in his head. He decided it was time to put the lie to his fears. He put on his shoes and stepped outside. It was spring, and the days hadn't gotten long yet. The sun had gone down, and the stars, even in the city, were starting to shine. Dan looked up and down the street, trying to look casual about it. He mostly saw vehicles he recognized as belonging to his neighbors. But there was one vehicle, a pickup truck, parked on the far side of the street a few doors down, that he didn't recognize. Dan realized that someone sitting in the driver's seat would have a perfect, though distant, view into Alice's office upstairs. He couldn't tell for sure if it had anyone in it. There was a dark blob on the driver's side, but it could be the seat's headrest or something else entirely. If that was Randall, he was far enough away that he'd have to be using binoculars to watch. If he was doing that, he might not have seen Dan, since the field of view would be narrow, though the light change from the front door opening might have given things away. He decided to walk down the street. He'd only gotten about one door down when the truck's engine came on and the vehicle took off, quickly making a U-turn that bumped the curb a bit, and then heading out quickly, probably just short of screeching the tires. No one had entered the truck, so whoever was driving had been there all along. Dan had started to run when the engine started, but stopped as soon as the truck had completed its turn and headed away from him. He tried to get the license plate, but couldn't read it from the distance. He thought of taking a picture, but it was too late. The only thing he could tell in the dim light of the license plate light and the somewhat poor street lighting was that it seemed to be composed of a wide blue stripe and a narrow orange stripe. That would mean Nevada. There were lots of plate designs for Nevada plates, as there were nowadays in every state, but almost all of them had a wide blue stripe, either blue mountains or blue sky, and another stripe, often orange, for either desert plains below or a sunset above. Meanwhile, Ohio, where they'd moved, had its share of designs, but they all seemed to revolve around red, white, and blue. Randall. It had to be. Dan turned around and looked back at his house. They had a lot near the end of the street at a slight curve, and so the house was not parallel to the road as most of their neighbors' homes were. The upstairs windows were clearly visible, and Alice's office was at the near corner. Dan could see her at her desk typing. He went to the porch and waited a few minutes just to see if the pickup reappeared. It did not. He went inside, turned on the porch lights, and closed the door. Then he closed the front drapes and went upstairs to Alice's office. She was busy typing. He knew she didn't like to be disturbed, so he simply went to the window and dropped the blind. "I like looking out the window," she murmured, not really looking up from her screen. "Randall was out there, watching you from a pickup truck," Dan said. She stopped typing. She looked over at the blinded window. "Okay. You need anything else? I've locked the doors and closed all the drapes downstairs." "No." "Okay." He kissed the top of her head and left her office. He left her door open, as she preferred. And that's the end of the episode for this week. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music, copyright 2019, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Persons and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.